So the rules are no more than 2 minutes an answer. So no one can take over. And our top ranked question is from Moira, who says, should all studies be pre-registered and publish pre-analysis plans? Who wants to tackle that? Nobody. Go for it.
Just to briefly start, and maybe then some others can chip in. Yes and no. So, to give you two examples, yes, if it's a drug which has been tested on animals, has had pilot testing in humans, and you finally want to work out whether it's effective and safe to be sold. No, if you're an engineer looking to develop a new technique to measure something in the body, and you don't know how you'll develop it, and you want to keep doing trials until you come up with something, and then later down the line you'll move into a study where you say, now we've fixed our technique and we're going to robustly find out whether or not it works.
I'd agree with that. Kai?
I'll be controversial. No. I think, not that I'm against them, and I'm certainly not saying that it shouldn't be a standard or a regular thing, but everyone no. Largely because if we get to a habit where everything has to be registered, then that means with every study you can start building very false expectations and hopes, which can really encourage researchers to try to force things. And we've already gotten into the era of trying to find significant findings. We've learned what that's led to with publication biases and these sorts of things. So I think if we start saying that absolutely every study has to be registered and no matter what, and there's no threshold for it, and we don't leave any decisions to the researchers themselves, I think that's a very slippery slope. So to say everyone, my answer would be no. And I'm happy to have a nice debate about that one.
So the only type of study where I have a really strong opinion on this particular question is clinical trials, because when there's any reason or counter incentive for researchers to keep the results closed. So, for example, if a drug went on trial to find out whether it worked or not, but nobody ever knows that it was even tested, that means, well, it means lots of things. Also that a lot of work will be redone because this was actually tested before, and it's a lot of wasted resources, but it also means that a lot of patients might go under trial, which was completely unnecessary. So when it comes to some things like clinical trials, it's a definitely yes. I don't have strong opinions about other types of research, but it's just because it's my speciality in these things.
Can I follow up then and ask you all a question about, I think both your points about clinical trials and basically lead to publication bias. So we want to eliminate publication bias and not seeing the lack of publication. But then we have a situation that we don't necessarily know what we're going to find. And one of the other key publication biases that I think we see is the file draw problem, is the small random orphan data set that you don't know what to do with it. And you don't necessarily know that's going to happen because you might not have designed that as a full standing study. So maybe Kai, I'll ask you, what do you do with your orphan data sets?
Pass. I don't actually have an answer for that, to be honest with you. What do I personally do?
Yeah.
I mean, we've worked mostly with secondary data up to this point. We've registered a lot with things like Prospero, and we're happy to share it. Anything we have right now that would be orphan, we haven't finished yet, so I don't actually have an example to say what we intend to do. To be honest, we haven't thought it through in all cases, because in many cases we're just trying to make deadlines within the nature of the project. And I think in an ideal world, we would have kind of committed data people to think that through as we start the study. If you know a funder that will give you that sort of resource, I'm happy to give you my number. But I would love to have the resource to say that we'd have some structured, organized way to do that all the time. And I think it was mentioned earlier in this FAIR approach of interoperability. I would love to think that we'd have a way to really encourage that with our own work, but I think it's a real challenge, and I don't have an example from our work right now.
Okay. Henry?
I will answer the question about orphaned data sets. I have a slightly different perspective. What proportion, I'm going to ask, of the data that we put into our repository is actually properly described in the literature, or some use is made of it in a scholarly article or a patent or whatever? And I would estimate about 20%. And the other 80% is sort of dark data or orphaned data that we can't think of a use for. But we've put it out there in the hope that possibly a small part of it might eventually be useful to someone else. But it's surprising how little data you find relevant after you've finished a project directly, but nevertheless you shouldn't really just throw away the other 80%. I'm not sure that's at all relevant to where the question started, but that's just my take on it.
I'm also happy to take it further out
Yeah.
on a tangent, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So just to talk about these orphan data. So we've discovered there's another type of orphan data that has actually been made available in a repository, but the description of it is so limited or so bad that you cannot possibly know what you could reuse that data for. Which is another type of orphan data, because it would count in statistics as here's a data set that's available. It might even be linked to an article somewhere, but the description of the data set is just insufficient to be used for anything, and then it's just sitting there taking up space on a server but will never ever be reused for anything.
Yeah, I think
another
that's the,
type of
that's the
orphan.
dark data point, isn't it? Okay, now the top ranked question is by someone anonymous, but I don't understand what PPL is. Is that people?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Not anonymous
So-
anymore then.
This is a question for Kai. Kai, you mentioned ranking of countries. Do you think it affects how people answer the questions? So I'm assuming this is the phrasing of positive and negative questions.
Sure. The participants don't see this as a ranking. They're not aware that they're
Okay.
presenting or representing a country. They're not. When they get told, they just know they're being asked a question.
Okay.
So it's not framed in any way that they see it as a rank. Not in the ones we're looking at. So I don't think that would influence it. Many other things will. Certainly, how it's interpreted, how it's presented on the day. These things will. The questions themselves, though, aren't. They're not at all based in terms of. You don't see yourself as representing anything when you're doing it except yourself.
Okay. I'm going to jump to the.
I meant by the question.
Mhm.
I meant that I think in popular media there's a lot of articles about well-being.
Mhm.
Always there are countries which are on the top. I'm a bit microphone shy, but thank
Mhm.
you. And Danish people are always on the top.
Mhm.
And doesn't it affect them when they answer that? Okay, we are really happy people, so I'm
Yeah.
gonna answer this like really happy. And there are like the Hungarian people, so always depressed.
Yeah. Yes.
And when you like see these questions like well-being, you're like, oh. So
Yeah.
doesn't it affect it?
Absolutely. So that's an excellent question. And this is a huge part of where we're going with this for policymakers. Absolutely. Are there any Danish people here?
Next.
Oh, hey.
Two very happy gentlemen at the back of the room.
Thomas, I forgot. A Danish person came when we first presented this, and he pointed out that many Danish people get offended when they hear this all the time. And two main things that they point out. One is Denmark went through a suicide epidemic not all that long ago and had tremendous policies and strategies to address that. The other thing that they point out is even within Denmark, and this is a large part of our work, just because the mean is high in Denmark doesn't mean there's a large group at the bottom as well. And one of the problems with being in those places, in places where it's perceived that everybody's doing very well, is yes, it can bias people to think they might have to answer one way or another. It's not necessarily because of the people around them, but what they refer to. So, for example, people in the Balkans, it depends what they refer themselves to. So if they refer to Germany and Austria, they say things aren't necessarily as good. But if they refer to other countries in the Balkans, well, then it depends which part of the Balkans they're from. So absolutely it does. But the bigger thing that we learn from this isn't just about the ranking of things like this, but that if you are in a place that's perceived as doing well and you're not doing well, you feel even worse about it. And there's plenty of studies that confirm this. And this is a big part of our message to policymakers, which is why we don't overplay the ranking element. We use it simply as understanding the overall patterns.
Okay. So, guys, the next question. Do you think that data sharing will help eliminate fraudulent research?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, that's something that's, as I mentioned, ClimateGate. I think that was about 8 years ago, wasn't it? And the data wasn't fraudulent, but it wasn't also open, and so people couldn't judge for themselves. And so a lot of the reason that we're all sat here today is because of the lessons learnt. But mistakes can be made. We've heard several speakers say, that even in carefully looked at, inspected data, they made mistakes, and other people, if they discover it, then science has benefited. So the answer is a categorical yes.
Okay. Peter.
To add a different perspective. And I would suggest that if you publish data, then that allows someone to look for fraudulent activity in one part of the process. But in the process of acquiring the data, You may be able to look at the data and determine whether or not it's been fiddled with, but there's no definite way in which you can determine whether or not there was any fraud in coming up with that data set, perhaps, I'd suggest.
Certainly in chemistry, there is often subtle ways. Isotopes, for example, were mentioned earlier. A lot of the recent fraud in chemistry, and it is at a very low level, I hasten to add, were because the fraudster simply didn't have enough knowledge of the topic to anticipate that their fraud could be detected by isotope analysis, which it was, and it was absolutely clear cut. You know, the data had been synthesized without isotopes. Now, there is no chemical on Earth that doesn't have isotopes, so a completely unrealistic situation. And so these things are often exposed by very subtle aspects of the data that you know, really do genuinely identify it as fraudulent, if that's what it was.
Yay for isotopes. Again, is what I say. And that's what they do when they look for testosterone and it doesn't have the right biogenic signal. Oh, so sorry, that's my little excitement for the day. Anyone else want to come in on?
I suppose a further thing about releasing the data like that, and whilst it's not absolutely necessary for this method of analysis, but one thing we've been talking about earlier about like the replication studies, some things are inherently not very repeatable. You know, there are topics like that. What releasing this data actually allows you to do, it allows people to do like individual level meta-analysis on it, which will actually pick up effects like that on a larger level. So I'm not talking about fraudulent effects here. I'm talking about just difficult to measure things. So we can do far larger studies if the data is released.
So I'm going to follow up on a question at that. One of the things that struck me as I was listening to you all today was I wonder if transparency is very different when you're in a field where you are generating your own raw data and then comparing it to other people, or you are drawing on either administrative data or large secondary data sets that were collected for a different reason. So I wonder, can you tell me if you think transparency and the way one goes about transparency would differ between those two scenarios?
Yes, I think it is very cultural and very, very different across the disciplines. And again, part of the reason of coming to a forum like this is it does bring home to you the fact that people do consider or think about their data differently. It is always an eye-opener to me to move away from a bunch of chemists to find out how other people think. So you can't anticipate quite how they'll respond. But I quite agree that if you've generated your own data, it is much easier to release it than if you're trying to analyse someone else's data.
Yeah. Want to say? No? None of the secondary guys? Okay. There's a question now about communal repositories. One of the other points that I think has come up today is that we've seen some really quite different models for data repositories, from the very, very highly organised one of large national, international, governmental funded ones, through to what is in effect Henry's electronic lab notebook for him and his research group, which could get bigger. So do we need communal repositories for early data detection? And if so, who should provide and run them? And at the back of my mind is always the idea of legacy and in perpetuity. You want to comment on that?
Well, I will say something about that. I actually agree with the fact that the best people to apply the initial best set of metadata, the highest quality metadata, is the community. They undoubtedly understand their data better than anybody else. That's why they're a community. And if they have the first attempt at adding metadata to their data, then the chances of someone else outside of the community finding it useful is increased. So you should start your metadata processes with a community that really understands it. I think that's one of the many benefits, but we're restricted to 2 minutes, so I shall shut up now.
Okay.
But your question was whether there should be communal repositories.
Yes, for early data deposition. So I
For
presume
early data
yes, so that might not
deposition,
be at the end of a
So
study.
and it comes back to I think it was Julie who talked about this, that at the end of the grant or the research period, there's just no time to go through this lengthy process of filling in forms or converting to the right data formats, etc., because then the research has moved on, the publication is out, and everybody's focused on the next grant, etc. If there's a way of making these processes appear earlier and that might be part of the whole open science movement. You know, make your data available as it is created, make sure you annotate it as it is created. Then when you come to the end of it and you publish your analysis result on that, well then the data is already there and it's already structured in the right way, and everybody will have an easier time with everything. But there's of course all the, especially the cultural, oh my goodness, I don't want to release the data too early kind of culture that works against that. So this is about getting beyond that and into the benefits of, if you can assign DOIs to your data, then you get credit for all the data you put out there, and it's clear that it came from your project, so nobody else said that it came from their project, etc., and all these kind of things. But yeah, I think it's a very good idea.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's a role in social sciences for early data repositories?
I'd say potentially. I mean, my experience with the ones that we're working with is that in the early days, so much ends up getting changed later on, that if people start using the early ones, then there can be issues later on. Presumably that could be fixed and improved, but I don't know if I have a strong view on the time. I think as soon as you can be pretty sure about the quality of your data, I think if you're wanting to share it and it meets other thresholds, then I don't see an issue with it. But I don't know if it's always necessarily super easy to do, because I think even the data we have from 2012, we get a monthly update that says what corrections have been done 4 years after the data were collected. So I'd say that timeline has to match quality. You wouldn't want to sacrifice the quality of the data simply to have it available.
Okay. The next question is quite... Oh.
Can I just
Yeah,
have a
Mark.
question, but as a continuation to this discussion? I really like this question, and I think there are two questions inside this question, like early data deposition, and that's good, and how do we make this happen? And the other one is about the discipline-specific versus institutional repositories. And I absolutely agree with the fact that discipline-specific repositories are the perfect place for discipline-specific research because they provide metadata, curation, and everything we all probably know about. But my worry is that like the recent things that happens, for example, with the SSRN, so the Social Sciences Repository, which was bought by Elsevier, and the fact that many repositories now struggle with sustainability that you also mentioned before, like, you know, for example, Gene Expression Omnibus, where everybody throws genomic data at them, they also now have no space of data because they have no sustainability models. So I'm just wondering what panelists think about this and how to ensure that discipline-specific repositories are first sustainable, and secondly that we have a sensible amount of sensible disciplines that can make it to the future, and that actually we don't have mushrooming repositories, you know, all over the place.
So so I think that the funding bodies also realizing this, just like they're starting to assign, like, part of your grant can be used for research data management. So just the fact that they're putting aside part of the funding to go for like software and infrastructure kind of things, I think that should go as far as the policy for the funding bodies going towards every time we put out such a grant, we make sure there's some, I don't know what the proportion is, but some kind of equivalent support for the long-term storage of the data, because right now all those data repositories, they are underfunded and overworked, and they are closing down all the time. So, and we're realizing this because we're indexing all these different data sources, and we find so many of them that just retire over the course of a year. And you're like, well, where did all that data go? And there's nowhere for it to go, because the other data repositories have, as you say, they have their storage full, and it would cost them more to store other stuff, and they can't just spend resources to reformat into this other format which they have in this data source, and then the data is just lost. And then what about all that work that went into making that data in the first place? And I think it needs to be the funding bodies, both the research councils and also all the public funding bodies should put part of the funding towards that long-term deposition and storage of the data.
I can come at that from a slightly different point of view. In 2005, 11 years ago, we were part of a team that put some data into an institutional repository. And there it sat for 10 years, unloved, uncurated, and slowly decaying. And it probably had another 2 years to go before it was switched off forever. So we thought, let's do a project to curate a 10-year-old data set. Because it was our data and we valued it, let's bring it up to date, let's clean it up, try and identify the errors that were undoubtedly in that data set with new algorithms, add new modern standards to the metadata and so on, and then take the whole lot, put it onto another repository. How much effort would that take? There were 178,000 entries, so that's a typical size. It took 4 months, but it was done. And we realised that, in fact, we hadn't anticipated a lot of things that would have made our life a lot easier 10 years ago. Had we done that, the subsequent curation would have been very easy. But now there's a new version of this, and hopefully the next curation in 9 years' time will be much easier than the one that we did. And so we tend not to ask, how long will this data live? Will it live forever? Will it live for 100 years? We say, basically, is it curatable? Now, the only remaining question is, does anybody care enough to curate it 10 years down the line? And we can't answer that. In our case, it was our data, so we did care about it. But would anybody have cared about it? I don't think so. But nevertheless, it is a model. Sort of every 10 years, you look at some valuable data, or maybe data that was valuable 10 years ago, you tidy it up, you apply modern standards, you put it somewhere else with these modern standards, you link back to the original data if it still exists, and you hope that the process will repeat. Now, whether that is sustainable, whether there's a funding model for that, I don't know, but it is doable.
Can I add a little bit to that? So part of the important part here, I think, is the fact that the data continues to be curatable. And a problem in the way that many data repositories are made today is that they've been in existence for a long time, and they were created in a way where you just deposited some data, deposited some metadata, and nobody would ever touch it again. So it was static information. But the new, and there's both some new electronic publishers like eLife and what's the other one? These new electronic publishers that are starting to enable both metadata and data deposition with versioning, so that the original authors can come back to a paper or a data set, update the metadata, update the description, make it a better version, make corrections, all of this, which means that it's no longer abandoned by the time that you deposit it in a repository. You actually have the opportunity to come back even after a long time and update it, which keeps it alive, which keeps it relevant, and which makes people come to look at it again, right? And I think that's part of. I think it's just in the last maybe 5 years or so that the community has really learned that it has to be part of the process in order to manage all this data. But unfortunately, lots of the current data repositories are not supporting this yet. I hope that they will do.
Okay. I'm going to jump. We can't have a panel discussion without mentioning Brexit, can we? I'm going to rephrase Tina's question, which is about what impact might Brexit have on UK HE and data curation. Because it follows on from the previous question about who is responsible, who should be providing and paying for these databases, these repositories. So who do you think, how should we, in a global intellectual academic environment, how should we be funding such repositories? And can it ever be done at a national level, in which case Brexit wouldn't matter?
Well, just to link into the previous one, so this 10-year curation, the first thing I did when we planned to take a 10-year-old set and create a new version is to go to my university and say, please can I have a letter saying you'll agree to provide the resources to keep it going for another 10 years. I thought 20, but they refused 20, but they agreed on 10. 10 is a nice round number. And so I've got that letter, whether it's worth anything. So the university, in my case, from its own internal resources, has undertaken to fund it. So that's not a global solution, but the other half of it is that all the metadata is now in America in DataSite, which I don't quite know what the funding model for that is, but in a sense, even if the data goes, hopefully there'll be a version of the metadata that might be useful to someone, and it's now curated by essentially a global organisation rather than a British one. So perhaps you should ask about the long-term longevity of data, but also of metadata, and maybe they're two separate questions, one of which is global, the other one might be local.
Okay. Jamie.
Are we potentially talking about Google or Microsoft or something like that? Got the money?
No.
Private company, I take your point. Oh, that was a bit controversial, wasn't it?
Because thinking about it, what happens when the money from BIS runs out for the
Well, this is what I'm thinking.
ADRN?
Yeah. Don't ask me.
64 million seems like a lot, but it'll probably
Yeah,
go in.
and I mean, if you look at the world we've got at the moment, it doesn't look like national government's really going to last very long either. So, yeah, you can run one.
Okay.
I actually think that there's a lot to be said about the way work is being funded now generally, whether it's from standard research councils or NGOs or any number of trusts. But I mean, one conversation we have constantly with funders for anything we get is, you know, if they're funding multiple things, shouldn't they be funding to have that data to be stored somewhere? Because why refund data get collected? Because I think we've all worked for funders that might have one round of calls for projects with 10 similar bodies of work going in disparate directions essentially, or being worked in that way. And there's no point in having discrete data sets. And I think that everybody's starting to realize streamlining is one way to go. And I think that for them, they can then look at if there's opportunities to commercialize this or things later, but have their own thresholds for privacy and storage. So I think that there's certainly potential that where the funding comes from benefits from trying to find ways to make data more usable for other projects as well, because why refund projects to collect more of the same data? And that happens all the time. I've worked on that data before, and I wouldn't say guilty of it because it's the way things are done now. But they would definitely benefit from looking into that as research councils with, you know, reduced fundings and trust and these things. And certainly plenty are doing this and looking at ways to monetize those things. I don't see there's a problem with that if it makes research sustainable. I'm not quite as commercial skeptic, I guess. But I think that it certainly would benefit them and also would help standardize the data that they generate through the funds that they provide.
There's the question.
Should we give you a... Hold on. There's a microphone coming.
So I think we're talking here about an international public good, right? I mean, data is kind of, you can use it again, it doesn't really get bad or something like that. So would be good at least to have an intergovernmental organization to be set up, funded from contributions from the funders, NGOs can participate, where actually you have a universal data universe or dataverse in a way. Instead of just having this inefficient piecemeal approach where we basically duplicate a lot of work out there.
These two, I mean, you have guesses, you have Eurostat, you have there's work in this direction. So it's not to say this doesn't exist, we can get better at it.
There's also a very interesting project, I don't know if anybody's heard of it, Wikidata.
Yeah.
Yeah. I must admit, I'm sort of about 12 months out of date with Wikidata and where it's going. But it would do for data what Wikipedia has done for knowledge. And I don't know what the longevity of Wikipedia is likely to be, but it's lasted 15 years. And Wikidata is certainly a very high level of curation of the data. It's very high quality. There's another model that we might look at.
Any questions from the floor? Should we go down the line? Okay, there's an interesting and provocative question. Why would you trust a journal? We can start
Any
with that one.
publishers in the room? No, seriously, are there any and you're from where? So. Right, okay, thank you. I won't be answering that question.
I'm open for commissioning.
I suppose this comes out of discussions we had earlier about would you put your data in a supplementary information file? Would you trust what is being published? Maybe I'll turn it around and say, why would you not trust a journal?
All right. Having said that, I'm not going to answer that question. I now will. I think the track record of publishers, by and large, in curating and looking after and adding value to data, is not very good. And I have a suspicion that if they did add a lot of added value to the data, they'd probably charge an arm and a leg for it. Okay, we have to give the publishers credit for the fact that the journal was invented 351 years ago, and you can still get a DOI for the first article ever published. So they've managed to maintain journals for 350 years, but I really don't believe they know very much at all about data. So the answer to that is no, I wouldn't trust them with data. Is that clear enough?
So I'm not quite sure what the problem is. So if it's just about storing the data, well, they stored the articles and that works fine.
Well, it's curating it.
Yeah, exactly. But is that then the publishers, or is that the data repositories, or those communities that are built around it, which is more the research community? So it's something about making the tools that enable the curation, and is that then the publishers, or is that the tools that are built around it, which maybe community build or even research projects. I don't know. I'm just wondering where, whether it's giving...
Well, we've seen a lot of innovation in journals, not as much perhaps as we could have seen in about 20 years. But I have yet to see much innovation when journals treat data. The supporting information as a 505-page PDF file is not what I would consider innovation on the part of the journals. So that's basically, I said, they haven't really done anything in the 15 or 20 years for data. Now, part of that is because it's not worth anything for them to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the answer is to pay them £5,000 for an article processing charge and £5,000 for a data processing charge, making £10,000 for the whole thing. And I'm sure they would then look after it very, lovingly for a few years. I think I'm getting carried away here, so I'm going to stop.
But I mean, one great resource that a journal can offer in this area is the idea of peer review of data. Mm-hmm. I mean, I would absolutely love having peer review of my data before I went into analyzing it, and to make sure, before I even collected it. And after it's there, if there's a way to say, if a journal has the ability to standardize data that's provided, make sure it's being used appropriately, control some level of the uses, it avoids having open data just become something that ends up in the blogosphere and people pull random numbers without any control, if they can control it. I wouldn't say, broadly every journal and every publisher behaves in the same way, but if there's a way to standardize these things, I wouldn't be closed off to the idea of providing it there, because at least you have a professional organization that may be able to set and control standards.
So if I say to you, Peter, that the problem with your 505-page supplementary information set is the author and not the journal, I would be horrified by me or any of my colleagues who thought it appropriate to produce a 505-page unbroken PDF. Actually, if you want people to use your data, you should be providing it for them in a way that they can access. And actually, isn't the point about we often use the word the journals, but the journal is a collection of editors, handling editors, associate editors, peer reviewers,
sure,
and people who submit to them.
They also have guidelines, and the guidelines are pretty weak at the moment, which allows a 505-page PDF to be submitted. However, the article will almost certainly be rejected if supporting information isn't available. But then the supporting information is handed over to an experienced PhD student who has not been trained in how to look after data. And so, yes, part of the problem is that universities are not doing their job. And to be even more controversial, when a student is registered for, say, a PhD, which is going to generate data, part of that registration process should be an undertaking to look after their data. And that the PhD will not be awarded until someone has declared that the data has been properly looked after. And that process is missing from universities as well. So yes, everybody has a role to play. It's not just the journal's fault, it's the university's fault as well.
I don't get paid for this, but I understand that DSpace, that the university runs, in Cambridge runs data management courses for graduate students.
Yeah, it's just researchers don't come for it.
So let's do a straw poll. Let's do a straw poll. We won't do Slido, we'll just do it with hands. Who is not embarrassed enough to put up their hand and say that they have been to a data management course? Okay, and who has not been to a data management course? Yeah, that's quite interesting.
I went to yours, didn't I? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm good.
It's not seen as something that promotes your career, really, either by the PhD student or the principal investigator or anybody else. There is no conspicuous reward system yet for looking after your data. That's pretty much bottom of the pile of what you'll get your promotion for, I suspect.
So my problem with this discussion is that from the data consumer's point of view, looking at the data, it's sitting there in the journal, it's easy to blame the journal. From the journal's point of view, looking at the data they receive from the researcher, it's easier to blame the researcher, right? Whereas I think it's more about, well, I have standards, I want my data to be well annotated, so I choose to put it in a journal that supports a well annotated data format that I know is useful for the community, and then that is my choice. So it's not about, because otherwise you're just like pushing the blame around, and you can go on forever.
There are good examples of exactly that behaviour. Mm-hmm. The International Union of Crystallography, when you submit some crystallographic data, it has to pass a number of quality checks. Some of them automatic, some of them done by humans. And so, absolutely, crystallography is perhaps the best example of data handling in chemistry, probably in any area, I would say. So there are exemplars, shining exemplars of how it ought to be done. But unfortunately, crystallography represents a tiny proportion of sciences, and if only everybody else would follow their lead, life would be wonderful, but they don't.
Okay, we've just got a few minutes left, so I'm going to start this, given that this is a very good and diverse and mixed audience, certainly in career stage as well. The question, what are your recommendations, panel, for early career researchers who are interested in working transparently? And quite interestingly, are there any risks?
Have a go. Yeah, and I think actually Alton asked the question earlier, and I think it's a brilliant one. Privacy and thresholds for privacy. I'm a social scientist, so I work with humans, not in a lab. So as much as I am happy to be transparent and to present things and have other people look at my data, my first responsibility is not to the general public, it is not to the funders, it is not to my academic colleagues or any peers, it's to the participants. And if their participation in what we're working on is not 100% as promised to them in terms of confidentiality, then it's not a trade-off to be transparent. If people want to accuse me of fraud, then I can live with that. And I think the best example of that is the Belfast tapes. If you're not familiar with that, I'd suggest looking it up, because it is, I think, perhaps one of the biggest challenges that's come up in recent years about privacy and confidentiality and what should and shouldn't be shared based on what information you have. I work on things related to people with mental illness. If I can't be 100% certain that no one will ever see certain elements of that information, then it's a risk that can't be taken with a human's information, because we know a lot about how to reverse engineer data and figure out who people are now, and you don't have to have an advanced degree in statistics anymore to do that. APIs through the Facebook tool are incredibly powerful, and statistical computing is now incredibly powerful. So I think the first responsibility has to be identified. And an easy risk is to say, I want to make this available for everybody and do what seems right in the eyes of science, but it has to be what's right in the eyes of your participants first if you're working with people. And I think that can't be compromised. And if you do, I think that can actually lead to a long-term risk. And I think that needs to be said as well.
In terms of early career researchers, again, I'm going to mention one person. He was an American, and his name was Jean-Claude Bradley. And he chose at a very early age, he was 27, 28, maybe even much younger, I'm not quite sure, to do his research career in the open. And so he espoused open science, and he did everything openly. And everybody, I presume, told him, you're not going to succeed because it's simply too competitive. You have to be closed. You've got too many competitors. But he didn't take that advice, and he did everything openly. And in fact, he got lots of credit and recognition for working like that. And what he did in the open was a valuable contribution to the community. Having said that, there aren't that many examples of a Jean-Claude Bradley, even amongst the early career researchers. I happen to sit in a room with 3 of them, and I hear them talking to each other on a daily basis about their career. And I occasionally intervene and say, have you thought about open science, publishing your data? It is so difficult to get the hearts and minds of these people saying that you're going to get recognition. Well, possibly they might, but more probably they won't, because everybody else will not give it to them. And that's a cultural thing again. Again, you can succeed, and Jean-Claude Bradley clearly succeeded.
Okay, Peter.
Just to turn it around, I would ask, what's the risk of not being open? So for me, I had my first attempt at being open a few months ago, and I've since found an error in the analysis, and whoever asked this question, thank you. You've motivated me to add a section to the manual saying known errors, because the risk of not being open and not being open about our errors is that someone will take our conclusions and work on them, and there will be a mistake, but there's no way of finding that out unless we're open.
Thank you. Okay, so on that note...
Oh, sorry. If I can add a bit more to it. So, fixing more on the early career research advice part than the transparency part. The advice that I always give is 3 things. Number 1 is to cite the data that you use, because the most important I was just about to say money, that's not the word. The most important value in the research community is the credit that you get, the acknowledgement for your work. So everybody, as the first thing they should learn when they use their own data, when they use other people's data, is to cite the data, because it's only by those citations you can start giving the credit away, which will encourage and incentivize more researchers to actually share the data. Step 2 is to publish data, which comes after citing data, because it's more important to understand that you need to encourage the other researchers to make the data available. After that, you can also publish your own data and get credit for that, because others will, of course, cite your data. Number 3 is when you work with data that has either clinical aspects, or in our case, genomics, that has some kind of personally identifiable information in it, you need to understand patient consent. You need to understand the consent that was given for the data that you are currently using, because if you do not understand the consent that was given for the data that you're currently using, you don't know if you're already breaking that consent. And it's only if you know that, you know it in and out, you know what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do, that you can also make choices about how to share it with colleagues, how to publish it afterwards, etc. So if you're working with clinical data or any personally identifiable information, you must understand the consent of that data.
Okay. You can go.
This is actually just a technical point, and for early career researchers also to point out, there are plenty of places that have data available to use, but that you have to physically go there to use it because it's held tightly and securely for reasons. So there's different ways to be open. It doesn't necessarily mean it has to be online and easily Googleable. The Dutch Health Services is a great example where people physically go there, pay a day rate to get access to the facility to use everything, but can't leave with any data. There are ways to make it accessible, and that's how they make it sustainable. So just to say that there are other ways too for early career researchers who want to use data that's already available because it's high power.
I think those are all great recommendations, and I think following on from the data management course one, my recommendation would be to work out that sometimes an investment of time at the beginning that you don't think is going to yield anything particular, it's not going to be a quick fix, will actually save you so much time in the end, and that is through from analytical techniques, doing all your groundwork, designing it properly at the beginning, and actually learning about your data and how you can and cannot use it will save you a lot of time in the end. Okay, right. Well, I'd like to thank all our panel for speaking today. Those are all excellent talks earlier, and for being grilled up here now by us. So if we can all thank the panel very much. And then, over to Martha.
Is that dismissed?
I think it was extremely useful panel discussion, definitely very thought-provoking, so thank you very much. And thank you very much again to all the speakers and all the attendees and all the chairs who made this event happen. I think it was truly amazing. And I would like to again have a special thank you to Sigourney, because she was really the brain of all these operations and in preparation and coordinating between big institutions like Cambridge and all the other SAS institutions. Believe me, can be tricky sometimes when you have all the different administrative procedures, with booking, with venues, with catering. So she was really amazing. So I think we should give some applause to Sigourney.
And also to Marta, because she's the person that is actually embedded with research data management, not myself, and you really need somebody in organising an event like this who really knows what they're doing. So thank you to Marta as well. Give her a round of applause.
So just before we release you for the drinks, which I hope that everybody is very excited now to interact a bit more informally, I just wanted to remind you about the Data Dialogue series. So as Sigourney mentioned, there are some other events within the same series. So if you like these discussions today, just go on the SES events website and you can register for the 2 other events. The next one will be in Oxford, and the third one
In King's College London in December.
So everybody is welcome, and tell your colleagues if you enjoyed today's event, you can recommend, hopefully, to the other people. And about recommendation and your opinions, we extremely value your feedback. So whatever you thought worked or didn't work, there will be a survey on Slido again. So if you can just, again, use the same code, the Data Dialogue, and participate in the survey, we'll really appreciate your feedback, and we'll know how to make the future events better. And in terms of the arrangements and what's going to happen next, just to let you know that we will have the slides, the videos, pictures. You have seen that there was a lot of pictures being taken in this event, so they will be all made available. It will take us a while because we have to edit the video, pictures and everything, but it will all be made available to all of you. And we'll also storyfy the events. There was a lot of people tweeting, so thank you very much for that you haven't switched off the phones, as I asked you at the beginning. We'll put all the tweets together into a nice story, so we'll have a record of all the communication that happened also via the social media. And some people also ask for the attendees' contact details, which is probably a very good idea, that you can reconnect with whoever you will interact today. So we will be sending an email to all the participants and asking you that in case you don't want your contact details to be made available, let us know. Otherwise, we'll share your contact details just with the participants of today so that you can connect to each other and perhaps continue this discussion or maybe have some interesting collaborations. So I think that's it from me. Thank you very much again. I thought it was a fantastic event, and now you're free to go have some drinks and interact with each other. So thank you very much.